Good morning. Today we're going to be talking about the English Civil War. We're continuing Unit 4, where we were discussing absolute rulers. And I think the English Civil War is a great example of what happens when people push back against their absolute rulers. So let's get into some background on kind of where England was at in the 1600s when this takes place. So for one, we are looking across the sea from France, where we've spent most of our time up till now, and looking at England. Now, England had monarchs, kings for hundreds of years, and it had gone through different stages of centralization and things like that. But we're not going to get into that. What we really want to think about is how absolute rulers are coming to power across Europe, and in England, that person who's really going to emphasize that is Charles the First. But England is a little bit different, and the thing that stands in Charles's way, keeping him from becoming an absolute ruler, is going to be Parliament. Here we have a picture of Charles, known for his locks of hair and for wishing he was as cool as Louis. So, England has a parliament. Parliament is a representative body, and it represents people from all across England. So you have people from, mostly upper and middle class families, but they are coming from north, south, east, west. They're coming from all over England to kind of like how we have Congress. They represent their area or their region. They get elected for their kind of district that they live in. So Parliament has jobs like helping to make laws, control taxes, help keep things running smoothly in the country. Essentially, Parliament's useful because the king can't make all the decisions for everywhere in England, right? You kind of need to have a group of people who are able to assist, kind of spread out across the area. So these are influential people who help make sure that everything is being done correctly. But in England, similar to what we talked about in France with the Estates General, in England, Parliament didn't meet at this time unless the king called on them to meet. So for years, Charles essentially just ignored Parliament. When they were meeting, he was refusing to listen to them, and then at a certain point, he did not allow them to meet for a little over 10 years, almost 11 years. So this is, again, a similar situation to what was going on in France with the Estates General, where Henry and Louis XIV had both refused to call on the Estates General. In a similar way, Charles I is refusing to call on Parliament during his reign as an absolute ruler. Again, we're in England. So as an absolute monarch, during these 10 years where Charles is not calling on Parliament, he kind of does a really horrible job. He does some things that really upset a lot of different groups of people. For one, he makes some changes to the Anglican Church, turning it a bit more Catholic than a lot of people wanted. Just as a reminder on this point, in England, ever since Henry VIII, which is a couple generations before Charles, in England, the king is the head of the church, right? He's the head of the Anglican Church, which had split off during the Reformation. That was thanks to Henry VIII, the whole situation with him needing an annulment from his wife so he could have a son. We've been there before. So Charles is making some changes to the Anglican Church as the head of the church. He has the ability to do that, but he's doing some things that a lot of people don't like. For one, just turning the church in general a little bit more Catholic, and I'm using air quotes here, because, just turning the services a little bit more like Catholic church services. Next thing is Charles is getting involved in a bunch of wars outside of England on kind of the mainland continent. They're unsuccessful wars. They're also expensive, costly, both in money and in manpower, which further makes people upset. Charles is also beginning to break certain laws that had been in place for centuries, essentially ways of raising money that are not allowed by the king. The king is supposed to go through Parliament in order to raise tax revenues, but the king obviously isn't calling on Parliament, so technically the ways that he is raising these taxes is illegal. And all of this adds up to a king who is lacking in funds, lacking support, and really recognizes that he kind of has to call on Parliament, let them meet to help him solve these issues, help him raise the revenue he needs, and do some of these things to put down some of the kind of rumblings that are happening within the country. But as Charles gives in to the demands and calls on Parliament to kind of help raise some money and quiet the citizens, Parliament doesn't necessarily want to play ball, right? Parliament just is going to meets up. They have representatives from all across the country, and before they're willing to help Charles out, they're going to raise their grievances with Charles. They're going to say, "Hey, Charles, funny thing, you haven't let us meet for 10 years. We got a whole backlog of things we got to talk about. All of these decisions that you've made without our help, we got to talk about those things. All of these taxes that you raised with technically illegally, we got to talk about those things. These changes you made to the church, we got to talk about those things." Parliament doesn't, before they're going to be willing to help out Charles, they want to essentially air out their grievances. They want to, kind of tell him off a little bit for what he had done. And again, this just raises tensions a little bit more, right? Parliament is essentially attacking the king and his choices. Parliament doesn't want to have an absolute monarchy. Parliament wants to make sure that they are getting some of the power that Charles has. Charles obviously believes in divine right of kings, believes in this idea that he can be an absolute ruler. He sees how other absolute rulers are kind of running the show in some other countries. And so when Parliament starts bad talking him, trying to secure their own power, Charles is not like that, does not agree with that, and it makes him angry. And so tensions are high between Parliament and Charles. And this is when Parliament does something that I think you should never do, and that's bring somebody's wife into it. So Parliament, at a certain point, decides that not only has Charles made bad decisions and this and that, Charles is also married to a traitor. Now, Charles's wife was a princess from France, and she was Catholic. Now, those two things combined make a lot of English people not like her and not trust her. The English, especially at this time period, did not get along well with the French, just in general. Were untrusting of the French. They had fought wars against the French previously, so this marriage was a bit of a kind of an alliance-making kind of wedding, but at the same time, a lot of English people didn't trust her because she's French. A lot of them didn't trust Catholics just in general. They didn't like the Catholic Church. Anything relating to the Pope was offensive to a lot of English people, so they don't like Charles's wife, and they accuse her of treason. And the punishment for treason is beheading. And so Charles is not going to let that happen. Charles is not going to take that disrespect because he does see that as disrespect coming from Parliament. He is the king. You can't just you can't just lob insults like this at him and his family and his wife. So Charles is going to arrest some people in Parliament. These 5 guys who are kind of leading the charge against Charles's wife, he's like, I'm going to get rid of these dudes. They're going to be arrested. They're going to go to jail. Maybe they'll get killed. Maybe they'll be put on trial. But Charles gathers up 400 soldiers. They march down to Parliament because he's going to arrest these 5 leaders. And everybody in the Parliament building, they keep their lips shut. The members of Parliament refuse to turn themselves in. All the other members of Parliament, basically let those dudes sneak out when the king is coming. And everybody else in Parliament just keeps their lips shut. They're not going to snitch on their friends, on these other members of Parliament. Essentially, they're standing up to the king. And this is all of Parliament standing up to King Charles. Not turning in the other people in Parliament, refusing to let Charles kind of bully them into submission. And this is kind of the breaking point. Charles has kind of tried to show his authority by arresting these members of Parliament. Parliament has stood up to his authority, and this is too much for Charles. He leaves the city and starts raising an army. He's like, Parliament's not going to listen to me. They're going against me. They're actively working against me. So I'm going to have to take them out. I'm going to have to get rid of them. I'm going to have to fight against them. Raises an army. Parliament, in turn, does the same and raises their own army. And so the war is going to begin. Now, when the war begins, the king goes to the countryside. And this is where he's going to raise most of his army out of wealthy landowners and nobility. As the king, he generally was working in support of the wealthy landowners. These are the same kind of, it's like he got along well with them. He relates to them a little bit better. And so in his case, that is where he's going to get a lot of his support, the nobility. And these people are generally wealthy. They generally have things like better armor, better weapons, better horses for sure. And so these soldiers that support the king are going to be known as cavaliers. And cavaliers are known for their kind of good horsemanship. Now, on the other hand, Parliament is going to raise troops from the commoners and the working people of England. This makes sense. Parliament is a representative body. It represents the people. And so Parliament is going to raise their troops from the people. Their troops are going to become known as the Roundheads, due both to kind of the haircuts that they were known for and the helmets that they wore that were a little bit more rounded. And so early on in this war, the two sides are going to duke it out, but there's not going to be like a real solid, decisive victory. A lot of the early success does go to the king and his side. He had some superior cavalry. He had some little bit better generals initially, especially guys like Prince Rupert. So early victories go to the king, but over time, Parliament gets better and better, and Parliament does a really good job of adapting and eventually overcoming the king and his men. And Parliament's going to really benefit from some new training and some strategy that helped them win the war, and we'll talk about how that gets implemented in just a few. So, this is just a funny little comparison looking at how they might compare themselves. The Cavalier might see himself as a noble, well-educated, nice-looking, confident, versus how he might see a peasant as uneducated, poor, like wearing different mismatched clothing. This is kind of how they might see themselves in this. The warfare, heavy use of cavalry, heavy use of gunpowder, and I really like this image where you can see them all coming together, where you can see how you have our spearmen here kind of keeping the horses at bay, our musketeers shooting the guns as the horses come up, our horsemen trying to pull a little bit of a drive-by, but obviously got to keep their distance because otherwise they will get jabbed by the spears. So this takes us to Oliver Cromwell, and a huge difference maker on Parliament's side here. Oliver Cromwell is a key commander for Parliament's army, and he's going to really revolutionize the training of Parliament by being strict and enforcing really strict and regimented training, both on the battlefield and away from the battlefield. So a big thing that he does is he cuts down on drunkenness by the soldiers. If soldiers are caught drinking, they'd be publicly placed in stocks and humiliated as a way of encouraging them to stay sober and stay sharp. Oliver Cromwell recognized that he wants his troops to be sharp on days of the battle, but also they have to be training when they're sharp and ready and prepared, and that's going to give them the best results when they are actually on the battlefield. At this time in history, and for most of history, soldiers being drunk the day before a battle or even on the battlefield, that itself is not uncommon. A lot of times people would be drinking before major battles just because they're scared. This is high opportunity for people to die. So it was a common thing, but Cromwell was trying to cut that out. Now, a big part of that comes from the fact that Oliver Cromwell was a Puritan. Puritans are a unique group of Christians in England at the time who follow a really strict reading of the Bible. So, not all of Parliament's troops were Puritans, but some of them were. I just want to make sure that's clear. Puritans are a group of Christians who follow strict reading of the Bible. Not all of Parliament's army was Puritans, but most of the Puritans were in Parliament's army. Okay, so big thing about Puritans, they believe in this pure reading of the Bible. They believe in very strict, conservative outlook on things, and they hate the idea of divine right. Divine right, again, is this idea that, God placed the king in power, and therefore the king has to be right. Well, for Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans, they don't agree with that because in their head, they see that as people pretending to know what God wants. For Oliver Cromwell, there's no way to know what God wants and what God's thinking. So if somebody is claiming that God put them in power, that's almost like claiming that they know what God is thinking, what God wants. And for the Puritans, they don't really agree with that idea. They also don't agree with this idea that there's one human being who's better than all the other human beings, as in the king being better than everybody else. The Puritans aren't necessarily for that. They're a lot more kind of based on equality amongst the people, rather than having this kind of separate kind of levels of society. Now, the Puritans are going to make a big difference on the battlefield, one, because they kind of go along with this strict training that Oliver Cromwell has introduced, but also they are become known for just being super courageous on the battlefield. All of their victories, they're trying to fight because they believe they're in the right, and that they are, they believe the king is in essence blasphemous. He is saying things that are incorrect about the religion, about their God. And so for the Puritans, it's a personal mission to get rid of the king who is kind of misspeaking about God, how they believe it. And the turning point in the war is going to happen at the Battle of Marston Moor. This is where Parliament really strikes a definitive blow against the king. But early on in this battle, it's interesting that the king was actually winning. The Cavaliers were winning the battle. They were fighting well, but they became distracted by all the loot. Essentially, at this time, people die on the battlefield. It's fair game for others to come and take their boots, their hats, their helmets, their watches, their, any kind of goods or, things that would be on their person. They might take it, right? Looting is a thing that happened. And so at this point, the king's men start looting bodies, thinking that they had won the day. But Oliver Cromwell leads his troops, they regroup, and they lead a counterattack. The king's men were so distracted by the loot that by the time they recognize what's going on, they are basically in retreat already, right? By the time they recognize what's going on, they're too disorganized, they're too spread out, they're unable to kind of defend themselves, and Parliament ends up winning the day, right? It gets the victory royale. And this is going to be a real turning point battle for the king. Just a little fun kind of side note is the real tragedy of the day, the death of the dog Boy. The story behind Boy is that he is the dog of one of the king's commanders, a guy by the name of Prince Rupert. I believe this is him right here. So Boy was just a dog, but Boy was thought to have maybe supernatural powers. He almost became the mascot of the king's soldiers. Boy was, thought to bring them good luck, thought to bring them victory on the battlefield. And so Boy was, kind of really seen as a mascot, I think, in an interesting way. He would be in propaganda and pamphlets and things that got printed out. Obviously, we can see right here, this is something that would have been spread across England as part of kind of propaganda. But sadly, he got on the day of the Battle of Marston Moor. And so Parliament has not just won the day, but they also have defeated the mascot of the king's men. Here's a little quote kind of describing what happened on that day. It says, "Cromwell's own division had a hard pull of it, for they were charged by Rupert's bravest men, both in front and flank. They stood at the sword's point a pretty while, hacking one another. But at last, it so pleased God, Cromwell broke through, scattering them before him like a little dust." So, what are the results of the war? And we'll get into this more with the next lesson. But in essence, at the conclusion of the fighting, Parliament was victorious. And I say they celebrated by cutting Charles's head off, but that's not exactly how it happened. And we're going to look at the trial and how they got to the point where they are taking the head of the king off of his body. And we'll get into that tomorrow. So, hope y'all enjoyed. I'll talk to y'all soon.